The world once again teeters on the edge of an abyss, and in this dangerous balance, one name resurfaces: Alaska. Some see only icy fjords, bears, and fishermen in thick jackets. But for those who read the map of the world not through a tourist's eyes, but through those of a spy, a diplomat, or a general, it is an arena where great powers meet like gladiators in a coliseum. Today, on this frozen stage, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin face each other. Anchorage, once a remote settlement at the edge of empires, has now become the stage where it will be decided whether the world gets a chance at dialogue or plunges headlong into a geopolitical abyss. The newspapers call it a historic moment, and I, William Henry Seward, simply smile, because a century and a half ago, this land cost me my reputation, a storm of ridicule, and the nickname Seward's Folly. But I knew what others could not see. Alaska is a key, and one day, when great powers once again clash noses over the Arctic Ocean, that key would be needed. And here we are. The ice melts, planes roar, and diplomats lose their voices in the back rooms. But before we talk about today's storm, allow me to take you back to 1867, to the night when I bought America's future in just a few hours for the price of 2 cups of coffee per acre. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy deep, fact-packed stories that come alive across the centuries. And tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. We'd love to see how far our journey stretches through space and time. I stand looking at the world map of the 21st century, and I see the same thing I once saw on my diplomatic tables in the 19th. Alaska is the knot where the roots of empires are tied together. Today, even the most stubborn skeptics can't deny this role. From Russia's Chukotka coast, it is separated only by the narrow strip of the Bering Strait, and on the Pacific side, an open gateway to Japan, China, and Korea. Here lie the northernmost U.S. military airfields. Here are the ports through which one can track the movement of any ship in the Arctic. And now, diplomacy. When Donald Trump decided to invite Vladimir Putin to Anchorage, he may not have even realized he was following an old tradition, meeting on neutral but strategically advantageous ground, a place close to both Washington and Moscow, yet firmly under American control. The press calls this meeting an echo of the Cold War. I would call it the continuation of the very same game we started playing in my day, because on the map of the world, there are a few places that combine a natural shield, an economic resource, and political symbolism. Alaska is one such place. But the 21st century adds another dimension: climate. The glaciers I remember as immovable bastions are now melting, opening new sea routes and sparking new disputes. Who will own these waters? Whose ships will have the right of passage? And will the Arctic become the next Persian Gulf, only with ice instead of sand? I know. Today, in the back rooms of Anchorage, they will speak of sanctions, security guarantees, and markets. But the real stake is control over the planet's northern flank. That is why Trump, Putin, and any other leader understands. Alaska is not a provincial backwater, but a foothold on which the balance of power between continents depends. And all of this is the consequence of that night in 1867 when I, under the dim light of oil lamps, signed the agreement that all of Washington first laughed at. The year was 1867. Only 2 years had passed since the last shot of the Civil War was fired. The nation had not yet recovered from its bloody wounds. The battlefields were overgrown with grass, but the political ground was still explosive. The North and the South distrusted each other. The economy staggered under the weight of debt, and the streets of Washington were filled with unemployed veterans. I was the Secretary of State of the United States under President Andrew Johnson, a man who had already survived an attempt on his life the same night Lincoln was assassinated. And I was a man who believed that America's future lay in growth, not in isolation. At that time, the mood in Congress was hostile to any major expenditures. The war had drained every cent from the Treasury. Yet I understood. It was precisely now, in this period when our enemies were weakened and our allies were still seeking balance, that we could act. The country needed a symbol that we were looking ahead, not just counting our losses. My gaze turned toward the horizons of the Pacific. We already had California, purchased from Mexico, and we were preparing to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. But to the north, hundreds of miles beyond our border, lay a land that could become the key to controlling the entire northern Pacific. And that land belonged to Russia. The idea of purchasing Alaska had first emerged seriously under Lincoln, but the war halted any negotiations. Now, in the post-war years, the moment was perfect. Russia needed money and feared that its American possessions might simply be taken by the British from Canada in the event of another conflict. I saw in this not only a chance to expand our territory, but also to strengthen our influence in the region. My imagination painted the future. Trade routes across the Arctic Ocean, fishing fleets feeding millions, and strategic bases capable of stopping any rival before they even approached. But before dreams could become reality, I had to convince Congress that we were buying not a frozen wasteland, but the future. And that was almost harder than dealing with Russia itself. For in America at that time, the prevailing belief was that we were already large enough and needed no more land. To understand why Russia agreed to sell such a vast territory, one must picture its situation in the 1860s. The Romanov Empire had just suffered a humiliating defeat in the Crimean War. The navy was shattered, the finances drained, and its prestige shaken. Alaska, or Russian America, as they called it then, was, for St. Petersburg, both a geographic and economic burden. Garrisoning it was costly. Supplying it was even more expensive. The only real source of income was the fur trade. But even that industry was in decline. Sea otters were nearly hunted to extinction, demand was falling, and competition from Britain's Hudson's Bay Company in Canada was intensifying. There was another problem: the British. In St. Petersburg, they remembered well that during the Crimean War, British ships freely entered northern waters and could have taken Alaska if they had wished. Russian diplomacy knew that in a new conflict with London, Russian America could become British without a single shot being fired. This is where Baron Eduard de Stöckel, the Russian ambassador to Washington, entered the stage. He was a master of behind-the-scenes negotiation and believed that selling Alaska to America would be both profitable and safe. Money would be gained, and the territory would go to a nation that was not an enemy. When Steckel carefully hinted to me at the possibility of a deal, I realized this was the chance I had been waiting for. But we had to act quickly before St. Petersburg changed its mind or someone in Congress stirred a political storm. For ahead lay the night when Alaska's fate would be decided at the negotiating table, and every minute could change history. What happened on that night when we bargained with the Russians until 4 in the morning? That is another story entirely. The night of March 29th to March 30th, 1867 was cold, even for Washington. The clock in my office read 10 o'clock when Baron Edward de Steckel crossed the threshold, wearing that polite yet cautious smile diplomats use to mask tension. We both knew if we didn't sign the deal that night, by tomorrow it might shatter like ice on a spring river. Why the rush? In St. Petersburg, they could change their minds. In Congress, an uproar could erupt, and the British, catching the scent, might stage their own diplomatic play. We decided to act here and now. Steckel removed his gloves, unrolled a map, and traced his finger from the Aleutian Islands to Cape Prince of Wales. Mr. Seward, Russia is prepared to transfer all of this territory to you. The question is, for how much? I looked at him across the table. Baron, we are not speaking merely of land and ice. We are speaking of the future dominance of the North Pacific. He gave a faint smile. So, you admit this land is strategic? I admit it is priceless, which is why we must agree today before any other nation takes an interest in it. We didn't haggle for long. At first, he named a sum that made me frown. Too high. I countered with a figure that made him spread his hands. Yet step by step, we settled on $7.2 million in gold, about 2 cents per acre. 2 cents per acre, he repeated aloud, as if tasting the words. Will your Senate approve? You know American politics, Baron. They will laugh at first and then call it a stroke of genius. He leaned forward, looking me straight in the eye. Then let us sign while there is still time. By nearly 4 in the morning, with the ink on the signatures still glistening, I felt the same relief as after a well-won battle. The deal was sealed. Russia renounced all claims to Alaska, and the land passed under the flag of the United States. But the real battle lay ahead, in the Senate and in the American press. Not everyone believed we had purchased the future and not just a frozen wasteland. I knew that within days, my name would be a target of ridicule, and the word folly would return to the headlines. But what happened when this deal became public? And how did Alaska greet its new owner? That is the next chapter. The moment news of the deal with Russia spread across the world, the echoes were loud and far from favorable. The London press, with its trademark condescension, wrote that the Americans have bought themselves an ice chest full of sea otters instead of gold. British diplomats in Ottawa, barely hiding their irritation, joked that the United States would now have more snow than they could ever shovel. In Canada, there were concerns that the American flag was inching closer to British possessions, and that it could upset the balance of power on the continent. In America, the reaction was no less sharp. Newspapers dipped their pens in gall. Seward's Folly, Seward's Glacier, the world's most expensive icebox. Those were the gentler headlines. Cartoonists drew me wielding a giant ice pick, as if I had bought myself a personal skating rink. On the floor of Congress, sarcastic toasts were made. To the new governor of the Seals, or let Mr. Seward explain how our farmers will plant corn on the Aleutians. And those were the jokes. Some outright declared that the deal was wasteful, that at a time when the country was barely recovering from war, spending millions on a frozen desert was a crime against the taxpayers. The administrative challenges only made matters worse. There was no civilian government, and control was handed to the Army. Soldiers accustomed to the mild winters of Virginia or the bustling streets of New York suddenly found themselves in endless snowscapes, where the only light at night came from the aurora borealis, and the way back to the mainland could take weeks. Yet despite this storm of criticism, I knew time would set things right. The first signs of new life began to appear: fishing, fur trading, and commerce with northern settlements. But the truly explosive discovery still lay ahead: gold in the Yukon, which would force those same critics to swallow their words. Why did this land, ridiculed in 1867, become a prize sought by the world's most powerful nations a century later? That is the story of the next chapter. After the official raising of the American flag in Alaska, we faced a simple yet brutal question. How do we actually get to the place we now have the right to govern? In 1867, Alaska's transportation map looked more like a series of dotted lines and blank spaces. Sea routes were the only reliable means of connection, but even they depended heavily on the season. In winter, ice fields locked the ports. In summer, the stormy winds of the Pacific could delay a ship for weeks. The inland territories were even more inaccessible. There was no railroad, no major highway. The only roads were rivers, frozen in winter, raging torrents in summer. Ships, steamers, icebreakers, all were luxuries reserved for the most critical deliveries. The Army, temporarily in charge of the territory, quickly realized that its mission resembled a polar expedition more than civil administration. They built small forts and warehouses, trying to secure food supplies and shelter for themselves and the local population. One of the first challenges was provisioning. Most goods, from flour to nails, had to be shipped from Seattle or San Francisco, and the journey could take a month. A ship delayed by storms or mechanical failure could mean an entire settlement going without supplies. Communication was another problem. Telegraph lines began to be laid only in the late 1870s, and even then they were often cut by frost or storms. Orders from Washington could take weeks to arrive, sometimes reaching Alaska only after the situation on the ground had already changed completely. Yet despite these challenges, Americans gradually learned to live in the new conditions. They adapted boats for icy bays, invented ways to dry fish so it could withstand long shipments, and even began experimenting with growing vegetables in greenhouses. This was only the beginning of a long journey to turn the wild northern frontier into an integrated part of the United States. But ahead lay a discovery that would forever change Alaska's fate. When I signed the deal with Russia, even I could not have imagined the full scale of this land's potential. In the 19th century, we saw mainly fur, fish, and a convenient location. But the 20th and 21st centuries have revealed that Alaska is a treasure chest of resources and strategic advantages that compel powerful nations to cast covetous eyes on it again and again. Let's start with resources. Alaska holds vast reserves of oil and natural gas, deposits of gold, silver, zinc, copper, and rare earth elements. The Arctic shelf conceals energy wealth capable of sustaining an entire continent. And while extraction in these latitudes is costly and difficult, global energy prices make it economically attractive. Add to this world-class fishing, salmon, cod, halibut, crab. These industries feed not only American cities, but also markets in Asia and Europe. Tourism is another story entirely. Cruise ships, national parks, and mountains that awe even those who have seen the Himalayas. But the trump card is geography. Alaska lies at the meeting point of North America and Asia, separated from Russia's Chukotka Peninsula by only the narrow Bering Strait. It is a foothold for controlling the Arctic Ocean and the new maritime routes opening up as the glaciers melt. Military strategy speaks for itself. During the Cold War, Alaska hosted air bases, radar stations, and missile early warning systems. And now, as global rivals regain strength, these facilities are once again in the spotlight. Alaska is not just land. It is a strategic asset that combines economic power with military potential. And so even today, in the 21st century, as the world watches leaders meet in Anchorage, this territory remains the same chessboard where global games are decided. But how did my Seward's Folly travel the path from ridicule to recognition as one of America's wisest investments? And what would I say to modern politicians if I sat beside them at that table in Anchorage? When I think back to that night in March 1867, I see not only maps and numbers spread across the table. I see the cold gleam in Baron Stuckel's eyes, the flicker of lamplight glinting off the ink of our signatures, and I feel the quiet triumph of a man who knows he has made the right move, even if the world has yet to understand it. Back then, they mocked me. They called me a spendthrift, a dreamer, a man who had bought a frozen wasteland with money the nation could ill afford. But the years have set everything in its place. When gold was found in Alaska's depths, oil on its continental shelf, and its mountains and bays became keys to the nation's security, even my fiercest critics began to speak my name without ridicule. For me, this story was never just about land or resources. It was about foresight, about the ability to see value where others see emptiness, about understanding that strategic advantages are measured not only in the present, but in how they can alter the course of history. Today, as the world gathers once more in Anchorage, I may be far removed from this era, yet I recognize the familiar patterns of the game. The same cold glances across the table, the same attempts to measure each other with words and with silence. The only difference is that now, instead of maps with hand-drawn coastlines, the table is covered with documents on nuclear threats, sanctions, and energy routes. I cannot know how this new match will end, but I know one thing. Alaska will yet again be the board on which great moves are played. And perhaps in those moves there will be an echo of that night in 1867 when a few lines of ink opened America's path to the Arctic. History is not just about the past. It is about how past decisions create the future, and in that future I am certain the name Alaska will be heard many more times. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy in-depth, fact-rich stories that bring history to life. And tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. We love seeing how far our journey stretches across space and time.